So my name is Michael Cumpsty, and I'm principally an actor. And so I thought what I would do is give you an idea of how I, as an actor, I'm not going to say how actors would, but how I, as an actor, would approach a piece of Shakespeare, specifically Hamlet's first big speech, which is in the second scene of the play. But before I launch into that, I wanted to refer back to something that Sarah Holdren said last week. For those of you who were here, you'll remember, but Sarah spoke about Konstantin Stanislavski, who was one of the most important of the theater practitioners of the 20th century. In fact, he sort of recreated the notion of theater training, both for directors and for actors. And Sarah spoke last week about what he did for directors. What he did for actors was he sort of codified a way of training and a way of working and rehearsing, which may not have been brand new, but he was the person who kind of made it solid, and it was picked up and dominated the 20th century, and indeed into the 21st century, in terms of how actors work, especially, I mean, in the West, certainly in the West. It really took off in the States, and actually sort of lagged and then took off in Britain too, and Europe. So fundamentally, this has two interesting components in terms of what I want to talk about today. So the first thing was that Stanislavski said, we want to do away with histrionics and melodrama. And we want to get to something that is closer to psychological realism. We want to get to something that is closer to the way people behave. If you were to see somebody in the given circumstances of a person in a play, if you were to see that person in real life, how would they behave? And that's what we should put on the stage. That's not always been the way of acting, of course. It's often been much more presentational, much more performative and theatrical than what Stanislavski was aspiring to, and what we in the current age generally aspire to. However, it's interesting to note, that was one part. I'm going to come back to the other part of what he said. It's interesting to note that that is not a new idea. Stanislavski was taking ideas that had been around since time immemorial, and this is demonstrated by a couple of points. One, I have this quote from one of his teachers, and she said to him that he should reject inspiration. And by that, I take inspiration to mean the kind of acting where you go, I'm feeling it, and you just sort of express the feeling, which may or may not have to do with the text that you're speaking. It may just be kind of demonstrating your emotional life while also speaking the text, if you see what I mean. And Stanislavski's teacher said to him, reject that, reject inspiration, embrace training and observation. She said, look your partner straight in the eyes, read his thoughts in his eyes, and reply to him in accordance with the expression of his eyes and his face. So basically what she's saying to him is that in order really to connect in the way that has become now, what we hope to find in performance, you really want to engage, and you want to be psychologically realistic in terms of how you listen and respond to your scene partner. So we get as close as we can to real life. Now, as I say, this was not a brand new idea. We know this because Hamlet says it. So what I'd like to do is, if you have the speeches either in a different window on your screen or in hard copy, would you please go to the second speech that I have in there, and you'll see that there's a small piece of it that's highlighted. So in the play Hamlet, for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, there is a troupe of players. There's an acting company that comes through, and Hamlet knows these people. They've visited before, but he also knows them from the time he spent in other parts of Europe. And he really admires them, but he nonetheless, as a sort of amateur dramatic, he gives them an instructional speech on how best to act. And what he says to them is, don't overplay it, don't underplay it. Play it for real. And so part of the speech that I want to quote to you, which is the part that I have highlighted, he says this: suit the action to the word to the action. with this special observance that you o'erstep not the modesty of nature. In other words, be natural. Don't overdo it. Be natural. For anything so or done is from the purpose of playing, from the purpose of acting, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature. So what Hamlet is saying is be natural. Don't overdo it, don't underdo it, be natural. This is what Stanislavski's teacher was saying to him, and this is what Stanislavski said to us. And this is what we've embraced in the 20th century up until now. So, bearing that in mind, how do we approach Shakespeare? Because Shakespeare would not seem to be naturalistic on the page, right? So we have to find ways within the structure of the text to release what is psychologically realistic and natural about it performatively. The other thing that Stanislavski said was that the best way to find this naturalism was to think in terms of action, was to think in terms of what the character wants, how the character is trying to get it, the obstacles that the character may encounter, how the character overcomes those obstacles, and how the character moves forward. And so you get what are often called objectives or intentions. You get what is, so as an actor playing a character, I would say to myself in rehearsal, what is my intention here? What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And how am I trying to accomplish it? And we do that for what we call beats. We do that for sections of the text that may only be a few lines long. And then we also think of objectives in terms of perhaps the whole scene, and then in terms of the act, and then in terms of the play. And the bigger one we call the super objective. That's what my character wants to arc throughout the play. And the way you build to accomplishing the super objective is by looking at the individual beats and figuring out how to activate them. And this is in opposition to, if you see what I mean, this is in opposition to just feeling, just acting feeling, just demonstrating feeling, being histrionic or melodramatic. The word melodramatic, of course, mellow means music, and it seems to me that melodrama is associated with a sort of excess of feeling because we think of it as the emotiveness that we might think of in music, not specific emotion, growing out of a thought or an idea or an argument, but a sort of generalized emotional tone. So you see, John Diaz refers to this as playing adjectives. Say to an actor, what are you doing? Well, I'm playing sad, or I'm playing happy, or I'm playing angry, or I'm playing depressed. Whereas what you hope for is that you can activate yourself as an actor, and directors hope that they can activate their actors generally to think in active terms. What are you doing? I'm assaulting, I'm persuading, I'm amusing, I'm seducing, I'm dominating, I'm, whatever. I'm transitive verbs, adverbs, anything that gives you a sense of actually engaging with something in order to accomplish something. So Stanislavski was big on this. This was Stanislavski's big thing. And it became known as the method of physical action. And that first word method, you'll recognize because that became the big American acting training thing, the method. All the big movie stars that we think of, like Pacino and De Niro and all those guys, even Paul Newman and Marilyn Monroe, they all studied with Lee Strasberg in the Actors Studio, studying the method, which grows directly out of Stanislavski. So it's very much the contemporary acting style. And what I want to point out is that Hamlet also recognizes and endorses active playing. So if you look at the third of the speeches that I have, let me see if I can actually share the screen on this one. Do I have it up? Okay, so again, a little bit, I'll sum up a little bit of what's going on in this scene. So the actors have shown up, and Hamlet has engaged with them, and in the course of engaging with them, not in the actual performance, but in the course of engaging with them and being friendly to them and sharing in their rehearsal, the senior actor, he has asked the senior actor to do a speech that Hamlet has partly memorized, that he knows, which is about Priam in the Trojan War, that the Greeks are winning, the Trojans are being overcome, the tragedy of Priam, and he talks about Hecuba, Priam's wife, and how much she is devastated and how much she's grieving. And Hamlet, after this is all finished and they've all left, Hamlet says to himself, that actor was so alive in that story. He was so, what we would call psychologically real, that it was almost as if he himself was in the midst of it. And Hamlet says, I am inactive. I am not able to exact my revenge, because at this point in the play, he's stuck. He knows he should avenge his father's death, but he hasn't figured out how to do it. So he's frustrated with himself and he's stuck. And he says, that guy can do it. I've just watched him perform this speech and he is so active. If he had my motive and cue, Hamlet says. All right, so I'll just read through this quickly. He berates himself. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul, meaning his emotional mechanism, his whole intuitive mechanism, to his own conceit, meaning his mind. He can control his whole emotional mechanism with his mind, could force his soul so to his own conceit that from her working, the working of this whole emotional intuitive mechanism, that from her working, all his visage waned, he went pale, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, his face, he looked mad, a broken voice, his whole function, his whole body, suiting with forms to his conceit, to his imagination, and all for nothing, for Hecuba. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? Now Hamlet gets to the point. What would he do had he the motive and the cue for passion that I have? He would drown the stage with tears and cleave the general ear with horrid speech. I won't go on, but my point is that Hamlet is saying, when an actor is acting well, you feel the potential for action. You feel the potential for engagement. You feel the potential for the accomplishment of a task. Now that is what Stanislavski was getting at. Stanislavski wanted to make the point that we don't want to go for kind of one general emotion or even histrionic general emotion. We want to go for a systematic accomplishment of tasks which build and build and build. You meet obstacles, you overcome them. You meet obstacles, you overcome them. You change your course, you change your tack. Maybe you change what it is you're trying to accomplish. And this is true for every character in the play. And so plays become a series of active engagements. And in fact, I didn't write this down because I'm just remembering it, but at the end of one of Hamlet's speeches, he berates himself for thinking too much. And he says at the end, he says that our intentions lose the name of action. If we think about it too much, we become inactive. And what we want to do is stay active. So in approaching Shakespeare, one of the reasons I chose to deal with the play Hamlet is because Hamlet addresses this issue of acting in this way. So I want to look at the first speech down here. I want to look at the first speech. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble figuring out my screen sharing. Okay, there we go. I want to look at the first speech with a view to figuring out how we can find our way into this very, knotty, poetic, rhetorical, all the figures of speech, all the heightened language, the fact that it's metric, that it has meter, that it has an established rhythm, how we can take all those literary constraints in a way and discovering that rather than being constraints, they can in fact liberate us into both a kind of naturalness, a kind of psychological realism, verisimilitude, and also a kind of active engagement with the material that moves us forward and moves the play forward. So, all that having been said, let me just have a quick squiz of my notes here. Let me just quote this for you. So Stanislavski's method he called a system. And here's a quote: "The system cultivates what Stanislavski calls the art of experiencing, to which he contrasts the art of representation." And what Stanislavski is saying is, we don't want to represent it. We don't want to show it. We want to experience it. We want to live it. We want to be it. Now, obviously, carried to its sort of extremes, you get where some actors that we've all heard of go to, where there is a kind of almost sort of self-flagellating, punitive immersion in the material in order to make it as real as possible. Now, some people go there. Some people go there, and, you know, good for them. We all try to. Some really do. And, you know, can probably jeopardize their well-being in the process. But anyway, okay. So let's have a look at the speech here and see if we, first of all, I'll do a quick run through it just to sort of explicate it a little bit. And then we'll have a look at the way the thoughts tumble, this sense that, well, first let me talk about what's going on. So this is only the second scene of the play. All we know so far, the first scene of the play is three soldiers and Hamlet's friend Horatio, not Hamlet, but three soldiers and Hamlet's friend Horatio, and they're on the battlements of the castle in Elsinore in Denmark, which is the home of the royal family of Denmark. Hamlet, of course, is the Prince of Denmark. His father is recently dead. His mother, who he loves, has recently, and I mean recently, like maybe a month, somewhere between 1 month and 2 months, has married her dead husband's brother. And the dead husband's brother is now King of Denmark, in spite of the fact that Hamlet was the son and heir to the king. Now, this is not in the play regarded as particularly strange. So scholars think, well, Denmark must have had a kind of elective monarchy, and there is some political tension with Norway going on, and so the populace at large, or the governing council or whatever, has elected Claudius, old Hamlet's, dead Hamlet's brother, to be the new king. So he's the new king, and he's married his sister's widow, Hamlet's mother. Hamlet is not happy about this at all. He doesn't seem to mind that he's not king, but he's furious and disgusted and feels utterly betrayed that his mother has married his uncle, because he doesn't like his uncle. Compared to his father, he thinks his uncle is, you know, drunken and debauched and just grotesque, whereas he idolizes his dead father. So we know that. So in the first scene of the play, you have these three soldiers and you have Hamlet's friend, and they're on the battlements, they're doing guard duty. And the ghost of the dead father shows up. And he has twice before, we discover. So he's shown up on 3 evenings. And Horatio, who's a rationalist, didn't believe them when the soldiers told him that this was going to happen. So he was kind of like, yeah, whatever. The ghost shows up and he's thunderstruck. And the ghost doesn't speak to them. But they figure that if they go and get Hamlet and they bring Hamlet back that evening, that the ghost will speak to Hamlet. So we know that. Hamlet doesn't know this yet. The second scene, we see the new king, Claudius. We see Claudius talking to his people, and he's being all kingly, and, you know, he's being patronizing to Hamlet, and he says, no, you can't go back to university in Wittenberg, you have to stay here, blah, blah, blah. They all leave. Hamlet's alone. He doesn't know that the ghost of his father is trying to contact him yet. All he knows is that his father is dead. His uncle, who he hates, is king and has married his mother. He's utterly disgusted. He's disgusted to the point of being virtually suicidal. So those are the circumstances, right? Let me read through the speech. I don't need that, I've got this. Okay. So let me just read through it and explicate it a little bit before we start actually looking closely at the ideas and at the structure of the language. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. So he wants his flesh to melt. He just wants it to be over with. He wants his flesh to melt so that it becomes nothing more than a dew, or he would like to feel okay about killing himself, but he doesn't because God has forbidden it. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. He's in bleak, dark despair. Fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. The world is like a garden that's not tended, that's gone to seed. It's disgusting. Merely means entirely, actually, possess it entirely. That it should come to this. So this is the crux. But 2 months dead. Nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to a satyr. So Hyperion was the father of the sun in Greek mythology. That's how cool he was. He was the father of the sun. So Hyperion is about as potent and brilliant and genius as you can get. A satyr, of course, is half man, half goat. Gross, disgusting, drunken, lascivious. Yuck. So on the one hand, he's saying but 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king, his dead father, that was to this, the current king, Claudius, that was to this, Hyperion, the father of the sun, to a satyr, to a drunken goat. My dead father was so loving to my mother that he might not permit the winds of heaven to visit her face too roughly. That's how much he loved her. He wouldn't let the wind blow on her too much. Heaven and earth must I remember. Why, she would hang on him, his mother, Gertrude, would hang on his father Claudius, as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. Also a sort of sexual metaphor. He's starting to kind of get this kind of seedy sexual thing going with the satyr, with his uncle being a satyr and his mother having this sexual appetite, which sort of disgusts him. So she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. So the more sex they had, the more she wanted. Like she became rapacious because he was so incredible. And yet, within a month, let me not think on frailty, thy name is woman. He just blames women generally. He gets a bit misogynistic at this point. Frailty, thy name is woman. A little month. Or ere those shoes were old, with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe all tears. Niobe is, again, a Greek mythological character who wept inconsolably over the death of her children. She was turned into a stone, and the stone continued to weep. So it's an image of endless, inconsolable grief. And the mother, what Hamlet is saying is that when his mother Gertrude was following behind the body of his father at the funeral, she was weeping inconsolably. And yet, before the shoes she was wearing at the funeral have gotten old, by which I take it he means they're no longer brand new, i.e., they're a little bit scuffed. The funeral shoes are still virtually brand new. Why even she, oh God, a beast, an animal that wants discourse of reason, that can't even think, would have mourned longer. An animal would have mourned longer. Married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules. Hercules, of course, another Greek mythological hero who was superhuman. So the uncle is no more like the father, then Hamlet is like a superhero. Within a month, ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes, she married. What that means is galled means red, when your eyes get red. So ere the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes, just means before she had finished weeping, she married. Oh, most wicked speed to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. Marrying, having sex with the husband's brother would have been considered incest. Incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot come to good, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Okay, so there's the basic setup for the speech. So the questions we want to ask, going back to Stanislavski and indeed going back to what Hamlet says about acting, the questions we want to ask is, how can we find the psychological realism in this? And how can we find a kind of naturalness? How can we find a realism to the performance of it, in spite of the fact that we're dealing with such heightened language and metered verse? So the first thing I want to point out is the metrical structure. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Shakespeare verse tends to be what we call iambic pentameter. And an iambic pentameter sounds like this. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Weak stress, strong stress, weak stress, strong stress, 5 times. That is the basic structure. Now entertain conjecture of a time or the barge she sat in like a burnished throne. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Now you can do that with the first couple of these lines and you realize it doesn't fit entirely. Oh, that this too to solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. It doesn't really fit. So you can switch meters around. So rather than going ba-bum, you can go ba-bum. So you can go, oh, that this too to solid flesh would melt, you see? Now, don't worry about it. I'm not going to stay this sort of rigidly structured. I just want to give you an idea of how that works. The simple way of looking at it, because sometimes it gets stretched, sometimes it gets compressed. The simple way of looking at it is that you want 5 strong beats in each line. Now, I have to admit that not every actor approaching Shakespeare these days is rigorous about meter, and it's largely because we don't have the time. It's largely because we don't have the time. We put these productions together these days in 3 or 4 weeks. Whereas in Stanislavski's time, they literally took months. In some European theater companies, and certainly in some Russian theater companies, they still take months. The Royal Shakespeare Company, for example, will rehearse something over a long period of time. They'll play it for a long time. They'll suspend it. They'll bring it back. So you get to live with, you get to marinate in this stuff. And as you can imagine, breaking everything down and finding the meter of finding 5 strong stresses in every line takes a while and requires a good deal of assimilation. So I'm being honest when I say we don't always do this, but I do believe that this is the way to find and to liberate the energy in the language and make it, ironically, more naturalistic if you follow the meter rather than less so. It doesn't become formally poetic. It actually becomes energized and propulsive if we get it right. Not guaranteeing I'm going to get it right today, but I'm just going to point us in that direction. So I'm going to read through a few lines and I'm going to count off the stresses. And then I'm going to show you a few particular lines where it seems like that's not going to work, but I think it actually can be made to work. So even though it goes ba-bum, 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 we're not going to do that in the first line. We're going to go, oh! Another great thing about this speech, which pertains to the psychological realism, is Hamlet is really upset. And there are 4, by my count, 4 of these big O's in this speech. And it's not something that Shakespeare does very often. So he's deliberately, that first one, you'll see in the 4th line, oh God. You'll see down here another, oh God, and down here, oh, right? So already that's a clue that Shakespeare is supporting us in our quest for what is really going on inside this poor guy. So we start with that. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. So another thing, another interesting scansion point in this first line, I think, is this one here. So this two. So my tendency, if I see two twos next to each other like this, my tendency is to go, oh, that there's two. But if you follow the meter, you go, oh, that there's too solid. And what happens is the meter, it's like a slingshot. The meter jumps you into the word solid, past the word two. Do you see what I mean? It's a tiny point, but it happens a lot and it really adds up. So that rather than, oh, that this too solid flesh, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, right? Already I'm sort of sitting back. Actors often say this about Shakespeare, is that once you've sort of found its rhythm, you can sit on it. You can just like sit on it and it will carry you forward. So, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon gainst self-slaughter. Oh, God. Here's another one of those. I would be tempted, without knowing that the meter was underneath it, to go, oh, God. But the meter allows you to sort of think about going for, oh, God, right? And that propels you into the next line. I get excited about this, you can tell. Oh, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable now. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable. Oops. And how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable doesn't sound right. So where's the fifth stress gone? How about on the un? How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Seem to me all the, okay, now here's one, right? Because if I go, seems to me all the uses of this world, I've got too many. If I avoid the me, seems to me all the uses of this world, I'm left with five, and I preserve that propulsive rhythm of the iambic pentameter. And that brings up a little thing, which funnily enough is kind of like a key thing for actors in Shakespeare, is avoid the pronouns. Avoid the pronouns, basically. Seem to me all the uses of this world, fi ont are fi, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed things rank and gross in nature, possess it merely that it should come to this. But 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not two, so excellent a king that was to this. Okay, now, how many syllables are there in the first half of that next line before the semicolon? Here, there are 8 of them. 8 syllables. We're only supposed to have 4 syllables for 2 stresses. Hyperion to a satyr. I'm going to suggest we only need 2 stresses. And why? Because Hamlet has gotten to the point where, in this comparison, so excellent a king that was to this other king, Hyperion to a satyr. We only need the p and the sa. That's all you need. It's a violently angry comparison. Hyperion to a satyr. Boom, boom. Only 2 stresses. It fits. Hyperion to a satyr, so loving to my mother, that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must I remember. So the rest of it is basically even, right? Basically 5 stresses to a line. And you can see, I mean, I hope you can tell by my level of like excitation how much energy is released by this stuff. So having established that at some length, let's actually look at the ideas and the way the ideas smash up against each other. Because it's the knottiness of these ideas. It's the overlapping of thought that is going on in Hamlet's mind that suggests to us the psychological realism of his distress and his sense of overwhelm. let me just sidebar a little bit and say, so, you know, Stanislavski would encourage an actor to think about what Hamlet is doing, right? We don't want to play emotional distress. We want to play something that is active. So what is he doing in this speech? And I would say that the answer is probably somewhere in the area of he's wrestling with his understanding of the circumstances. They are almost incomprehensible to him. And so he's trying to sort of bring them under some kind of control. He's trying to make sense of them. And he fails. He fails. That's the obstacle he comes up against, is he can't do the thing that he's trying to do. But he pushes and pushes and pushes until people approach and he has to shut up. And you'll notice that the last line of the speech, look at the last line of the speech here, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. So he's going to be heartbroken and silent. He hasn't figured it out. And that's fine, because what's about to happen is these people who are entering are his friends who are going to tell him, we got a message for you from your dead father, basically. We think it would be a really good idea if you would come and join us on the battlements tonight. Your dad wants to talk to you. And he's like, what? And he goes and he meets his father. His father tells him that he was murdered by his brother. And among other things, many other wonderful things, Hamlet says, "Oh, my prophetic soul," which I take to mean that even in this scene, even in this speech, even though he doesn't say it, he has intimations of foul play. He has intimations that his father and maybe even his mother are, his uncle. He has intimations that his uncle and maybe even his mother are responsible for the death of his father. So back to our speech, it's fine for our purposes for Hamlet to fail in this. So actively speaking, he's wrestling with, he's trying to deconstruct and reconstruct his understanding of these circumstances to try to make some kind of sense out of them, and he fails. Now, what I would propose, my impulse as an actor, and if I were directing and my impulse as a director, would be to say, let's push at keeping it as naturalistic as possible, trying not to get into histrionics, trying not to get into huge emotive melodramatic gesture, keeping it as naturalistic as we can. Let's push it to the point of failure, because that is what the structure of the play allows. I like when I put a character together, or when I teach, I like this image, which is, you know, those little runs, the rodent runs, like the hamsters, that are made out of clear plastic tubing, and you can sort of create an architecture for them. I've never owned one, but I've seen them in pictures, and I think that they look fantastic. I imagine building a role as constructing one of these tubes through which, once it's built, you can luge. You can just start the performance and you kind of go, and you've constructed that. So you don't have to make it up on the spot. You flow through it. And what I would suggest here is that as Hamlet opens his mouth to speak this speech, he plummets like the stock market recently, right? And he goes down. His friends come in. They say, your father wants to speak to you, basically. And he goes, and he gets as high as he needs to be to start the process of his vengeance, which those of you who know the play will know, you know, there are hiccups, there are sidebars, you know, he accidentally kills Polonius, he has an opportunity to kill Claudius, he doesn't take it, you know, stuff happens. He has a big fight with Ophelia, you know, stuff happens. But I love the idea that in building the architecture of this role, you plunge down in this speech, you fly up again with the first meeting with the ghost. And from there, it's, you know, any number of twists and turns to the end of the play. So I would invite you to think of this play, to think of this speech as an exercise in profound frustration and distress. Now that sounds like I'm saying, think of it in emotional terms. And of course, the way the given circumstances and the way Hamlet is thinking about it come together release emotion. They release emotion. I had a teacher once, a venerable teacher. She had been the master voice coach at the Royal Shakespeare Company for a long time. And I was lucky enough to work with her a few times, not at the RSC, well, one time at the RSC, but in the States, I worked with her too. And she would say this thing, which many people found incomprehensible and really provocative. She would say, this work has nothing to do with feeling. It's about thinking. And what she meant by that, she wasn't trying to take the emotional intensity out of the plays, or indeed out of the performances. But what she was saying was, you release the emotion by thinking the thoughts. And the hard thing about reconstructing human behavior, you know, as an actor, reconstructing what was the motive, what was the behavior, working backwards to it from text, is that it doesn't work as easily backwards as it does forwards. In life, we have an impulse, we have a motivation of some kind, we want something, we go and get it. It propels. Rebuilding that backwards is hard. The way to do it is through the language, through the ideas. Be true to one idea, find the way that it connects to the next. Be true to the connection and move forward. So, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt Thor and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. I want to die. Oh, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fight is an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely, that it should come to this. Now you see the way that line is broken up, possess it merely. This next thought starting in this same line, that gives you a sense of how those two thoughts come smashing together, because often if Shakespeare doesn't want a thought to smash together, he'll put it on the next line. That it should come to this, but 2 months dead, again, a fractured thought. Nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion, to a satyr, so loving to my mother. Again, the line, the two thoughts smashed up against each other in the middle of a line. So loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must I remember. Now, did you feel, I may have demonstrated it a little too much because this is what I think is going on, but the thoughts are smashing up against each other in those earlier lines. And then he gets to, so loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth. You feel how gentle that is? It just naturally is. It's not because I'm necessarily forcing that on it. It just is. He has this image of his father protecting his mother, and his heart just melts. He can't stop himself. However much he thinks he hates his mother right now, he can't stop himself. So loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must I remember. Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and yet within a month. Can't follow that thought. Let me not think on frailty, thy name is woman. A little month. You hear how fractured it is, how fragmented the thoughts are sort of breaking and bouncing off of each other. A little month, or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe all tears. And again, I feel like Hamlet, who loves language and he's really good with language, he gets this image of Niobe and the shoes, pops into his mind, and he likes it. He thinks, wait a minute, that's good. And so the language smooths out because he's in control. He's in control of his language. He's in control of his metaphor. And yet within a month, let me not think on frailty, thy name is woman, not in control. A little month, wait a minute, I have a good metaphor. Or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe, all tears. That's as far as he can get. Why she, even she, he has to break that up. He's so distressed. Oh, God, another interruption, a beast that once discourse of reason would have mourned longer, back to the original thought, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I, to Hercules, within a month. Again, a broken thought. Another metaphor that he likes. Ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes, she married. You see how when he kind of pulls himself into a metaphor that he can ride for a couple of lines, it's kind of a relief. She married. Oh, most wicked speed to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. Ugh. You know, he's doing that thing that I think probably almost every child does when they imagine their parent in a sexual situation. They just, ah! And especially given that it's, you know, this uncle who he despises and abhors, and he has intimations of foul play. He thinks his uncle may have been responsible for his father's death. It is not, nor it cannot come to, good. It's about to hit the fan. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. I can't speak. You get the sense that this would have kind of been the end for him if his friends hadn't walked in and told him that his dad wanted to speak to him. So I hope that, I've gone a little over, I hope that gave you a sense of these two things that I was trying to indicate. One, how the structure of the language, the shape of the language, the meter of the language, supports a kind of naturalistic investigation of the character. And the second thing I wanted to engage with was this notion of choosing to be active, choosing to have something to do with the material rather than wallowing in the emotion of it. And in this case, I think what Hamlet's doing is he's trying to make sense of something that can't be made sense of emotionally, and so he fails. He pushes himself, and so you don't get a sense of accomplishment in this speech. You don't get a sense of achievement. You get a sense of impending collapse, impending fragmentation and catastrophe, which is actually averted because the ghost gives him a reason to act. Although, of course, it all ends up fragmented and catastrophic anyway. So, all right, that will do from me. So I'll hand it over to Hannah, Jen, and Taylor, and they can tell me what to do next.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Michael, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that. That was so fantastic. For all our attendees, if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat. We can start right off with this question from Stephen. He's wondering a little about the punctuation and how some sources might have different, depending on the publisher or the source, the punctuation might be different, one version of the play to another. How does that feed into your process? Kind of what do you make of that?
Yeah, so there were different original forms of publication of Shakespeare's plays. There were folio printings. A folio is a big old book like this, and then later there were quarto printings. A quarto was a smaller publication, and they came later, and they were edited by different people or typeset by different people, and there were errors, and there may have been deliberate changes. And so there is a good deal of variety in the punctuation that exists in various editions of Shakespeare's plays. And so how do you deal with it? You basically sort of, you can sort of defer to the experts like this. The Arden Shakespeare is a very good series of Shakespeare plays. And you will see that in many cases, here, for example, this is the notes. Can you see that? This is the notes. This is the text. So all this are notes on this text. They're not necessarily about punctuation, but many of them are. So you either defer to the experts or you go back and you look at the originals. Now, this is not actually a case of punctuation, but it is a case of these differences. In the very first line of this speech that we've been considering, oh, that this too solid flesh, the word solid does appear in the first folio, but in the subsequent publication, in the quarto, it's the word sallied, which they think was an error for sullied. Sullied. So there's this debate whether that word should be solid, sallied, or sullied. And in fact, I cheated because I copied this text from the Folger Shakespeare site, and they had sullied, and I changed it to solid because I personally think solid is better because he's talking about melting, he's talking about thawing, so it makes sense. One editor I read said, that's an obvious interpretation, perhaps too obvious. And I was like, no, perhaps too obvious. No, I like solid, but that's my choice.
All right, our next question is from Carol. Hamlet seems to overthink what he wants to do. Is it difficult as an actor to play thinking?
Ah, very good question. And the answer to that question is exactly what Stanislavski would encourage, which is examining each thought, getting inside it, understanding what the bridge is to the next one, building that connection so that you have, I don't want to say choreography exactly, so that you have a map to follow. So you're not playing thinking, you are actually thinking. You're actually thinking the thoughts. And that goes a long way to creating this verisimilitude, this naturalism, because it's very easy to speak lines without really thinking them, to emote them. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. I don't have to be thinking that. I can just like weep it, right? Ideally, you want to think every thought. And I played the part, and I got to tell you, it's like a roller coaster. If you think through it, it just carries you with it. It does. The thinking of it is kind of like the meter. The thinking through it releases an energy that supports you through the whole thing.
Fantastic. All right. Our next question is from Mark, who had the great pleasure of seeing you in Two River Theater's production of Dancing at Lunasa. And he is wondering how you prepare, how your prep for Friel's glorious monologues compares to your prep for Shakespeare.
Really no different, except that the language is somewhat more accessible. It's an interesting parallel, actually, because that character in Dancing at Lunasa, you know, for those of you who don't know the play, there's an old priest who's very sick. He's come back from years in Africa, and he's got a disease, and he's very sick, and he's losing his mental coherence, and so things are fractured for him, and that fracturing is not unlike what we were just examining here, but actually no different in terms of identifying what the thought is, identifying the action for the character, not that it's the same for Father Jack as it is for Hamlet at all, but identifying the objective, identifying what you want, understanding what the obstacles are to what you want, understanding how you either do or don't overcome the obstacle, what you have to do next. Understanding that in terms of real human behavior is common to working on Brian Friel and Shakespeare.
All right, the next question, and this might be our last question, so if anybody has any other burning things they'd like to ask, now is the time. This question is from Brian. As an actor, is there a danger of becoming, like Hamlet, paralyzed by analysis?
Yeah, no question. And what usually happens, this is commonly my experience, and it's the experience that when I remark on it, a lot of other actors say to me, "Yep," is that you think about this stuff for the first 2 weeks of rehearsal sort of intensively, and it does. You do have to sort of let it go. And the analogy of building the architecture of that hamster run is that you got to get it built, and then you've got to trust it, and then you've just got to luge through it. So that and in that transitional period, before you can release and just kind of fly with the decisions you've made, it can be very herky-jerky indeed, and that can be very frustrating and depressing. And there's this common sort of, funk that hits an acting company sort of at the end of the second week, where everybody's like, I've lost it. It was so good on the first read through, and now I don't know what I'm doing. And then, sort of by the time you open, hopefully you've got it back. So yes, you can get yourself a little bit mired until it releases, if it releases.
I believe that's all the questions we have for today. Yeah, people are saying thank you so much for hosting this. I especially loved hearing about how Michael uses the meter to unlock the meaning in the lines. Yeah, a bunch of people saying thank you.
Thank you.
But yeah, so thank you so much, Michael. This was wonderful. As we said in the beginning, we did record this session, so we will be sending the link to that if you want to access it at a later date, along with a post-event survey. So check your email over the next day or so. And also, I just want to mention, we haven't officially announced it, so you guys are getting an early announcement, but for next week's Shakespeare Sunday, we are going to start a play reading, a community play reading of Romeo and Juliet. It's actually going to be over 5 weeks, one for each act, and it will be led by John Diaz, and it will be featuring some Two Rivers staff members and guests. So if you want to participate in that, we will also make sure to include that in our post-event email that will be sent out to all of you. I believe that's everything I have. Again, thank you so much, Michael Cumpsty. This was wonderful.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you all next Sunday. Got a lot of applauses and thumbs up. Awesome, awesome. Thank you.